Welcome to Afterwards. My name is David Brooks, and we are here to talk about a book called The Neoconservative Persuasion, selected essays from 1942 to 2009. And the book was written by, this consists of writings written by Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol is not here because he died last year in September, but we are joined by his son, Bill Kristol, who will probably need no introduction to anybody watching this. Bill Kristol grew up in New York. Let's see if I know your resume. Used to be my boss, went to Harvard University, taught at Penn, worked for William Bennett at the Education Department, Dan Quayle, and now edits a fine magazine where I used to work called The Weekly Standard.
Very well done.
Thank you, thank you. And so I thought we'd start by talking about your dad's life, because I think neoconservatism and a lot of American conservatism flows out of his life. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about was his upbringing, the social class he was raised in, what your, I guess, grandfather did. Right. Because I think those roots informed a lot of his writing later on.
He grew up poor, but I think he says somewhere maybe in this book that he didn't realize he was poor, that everyone was poor in his neighborhood in Brooklyn. Poor working class. His father, my grandfather, was employed as a jobber and a tailor, and I think fairly regularly employed, though I think in the Depression, like everyone else, he lost his job and may have had to start over once or twice. But I think my father had his mother died when he was young, when he was a teenager, but apart from that, I think he had a happy childhood, and I think very much of a sense that there was none of the class resentments that Marxists wanted to think that the working class should have in the 20s and 30s, and none of the alienation that later sociologists thought that, being a Jewish kid in a Christian America would cause. I think he had a happy and well-adjusted childhood and then went to City College of New York.
Yeah, and I think, well, we'll get to this later on, but he would talk about, people would say, well, poor people think this, poor people think that. And he'd say, wait, we were poor. We didn't think any of this stuff.
Right.
So then he went to City College, a legendary place, and I talk to college students these days about City College, and the way that I say, I don't know if this is true, but I hope it is, that the faculty was sort of impressive. There was a famous philosopher, Morris Raphael Cohn, I think it was there. But the lunchtime conversations were more impressive, and famously, young students sat at two alcoves, Alcove 1 and Alcove 2, and I think one was Trotskyite, one was Leninist. Yeah. I assume your father was in the Trotskyite.
I think there may have been more than two alcoves. Well, there were just alcoves, were just, the little parts of the dining room, I guess, and then maybe they were technically called Alcove 1 and Alcove 2, but each got associated. The people would bring their lunches, I think, or buy very cheap lunches from the cafeteria, and would sit with their fellow ideological group. But I think there were maybe more than two: Social Democrats and Mensheviks, and there were many varieties of Marxists, quasi-Marxists, anti-Stalinist Marxists, pro-Stalinist Marxists. My father was a Trotskyite. Much has been made of this afterwards. I don't know that it was quite as big a deal. I mean, he had fond memories of it, and he thought he learned a lot having to argue with Stalinists and argue with other socialists and having a sort of system of thought that made you, be very serious about the world and make distinctions and have complicated arguments about why the Soviet Union was or wasn't in the spirit of Lenin, and was Lenin itself in the spirit of Marx, and all of that. I think one thing he learned from all of that was the limits of all these systems and ideologies. He became pretty skeptical about.
Who were some of the other students who then went on to have great careers with him?
Well, Daniel Bell was there, a great sociologist who's co-edited The Public Interest with my father for several years and is alive and well, emeritus professor at Harvard. One of his closest friends was a man named Martin Diamond, who died much younger in the late 70s, but really was one of the key people in revitalizing the study of the Founding Fathers. He would be happy to be alive today and see the Constitution cited everywhere. Really, I mean, it was such a lone enterprise when he did it. My father has a piece in this book, and I was looking through it in 1987, celebrating the Constitution, and I thought, well, that was also 23 years ahead of its time. But there were many famous people who went on to be pretty famous intellectuals, people who went on to be famous in other ways.
Was Nat Glaser there? Was he a student?
Nat Glaser, I believe, was a student at CCNY at the same time, another famous sociologist. And I think it was a very good education, as you say, but I think this is true today in college, too. Much of the education came from fellow students, not from the courses and not from the faculty. But he went through that, and meanwhile met my mother, who was a student at Brooklyn College, but they were both Trotskyites, so they met at some Trotskyite meeting, and that was one good effect of Trotskyism, that it brought my parents together. I have a personal stake in thinking this was a good thing, Yeah, but it was a very happy marriage and
didn't end as well for Trotsky.
Yeah, exactly, right. He got killed, murdered by the Stalinists, but my parents got happily married. Yeah.
So one of the stories I tell, I read this somewhere, that at one point the smart kids were all the Trotskyites, I think. And
Mostly,
at
I
one
think.
point, the Stalinites decided they were losing too many battles, so they said, "We will no longer talk to the Trotskyites." And such was discipline, party discipline, even among college kids, that they actually didn't do it, and they all lived in the same neighborhoods. But that was, I don't know, I think college students today look at that period and think, wow, they really were serious about ideas. But I assume because they thought, well, the whole world will be Marxist someday, and so
Right.
the distinctions we make now will actually have big effects later on.
Well, and I think the degree to which the Depression, I mean, and then the 30s in general, the combination of the Depression and the rise of fascism and Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and then Mussolini, and then Hitler, and then 1936 and 1938 with Czechoslovakia. I mean, the degree to which I think if you were in college in 1939, my parents have said this to me, I mean, they just thought the world was had fallen apart, and either was going to just continue falling apart, and then, of course, this horrible World War, and that it would just kind of go back into barbarism or chaos, or maybe there was some system that could get us out of this. But the degree to which I think everyone thought that all the views people had had in 1928, the more conventional views, liberal or conservative, strong capitalist or mild capitalist, that those were all discredited. I think people really felt that maybe more than we appreciate if you were a smart kid going to college in 1935 or 36 or 37.
Right. So he's in this hothouse atmosphere, and then he goes to the Army.
Right, he moves to Chicago, where my mother was in grad school, and gets drafted into the Army, and goes over to Europe a little behind D-Day. So he kind of, I think his group, 12th Armored, lands in Europe, and or his part of the 12th Armored lands in Europe late in 1944. And he's in the Army for a couple of years, and most of it is, the war ends, and most of it is at peacetime occupying Germany, and then in Marseille, where he got to work on his French and read a lot of literature. He didn't have to, I have the impression he had a certain amount of spare time, and he was able to read, Camus and Sartre and all these people in French.
Somewhere he said he believed in socialism, then he got to the Army and saw the people he was with and decided it would be a racket.
Yeah, that's in his autobiographical
Yes.
memoir, which is in this book, and which he wrote in 1995. Yeah, I think he had a certain, it's easy to romanticize the working class, and romanticize what would happen if only all these authoritarian structures disappeared, until you actually get with a bunch of 19 and 20-year-old kids, and you see there's a utility to having hierarchy, and there's a utility to having rules and limits on what people can do. He didn't talk much about the war, though I think he was really, I think that struck him, the degree to which, if you have a military force, that absent strong rules, there'd be a lot of bad behavior, including bad behavior to German civilians, for example. When he was in Germany, he was a Jewish kid from New York, but nonetheless, I think he felt some sympathy for these civilians whose country had totally crumbled around them, and maybe they hadn't had much to do with it, and there they were, and sort of at the mercy of Russian troops if they were in the wrong part of Germany, or if they were much luckier, they were at the mercy of British or American troops. But yeah, I think it removed what was already disappearing, if you read his very early essays in this book, an excessive romanticism about the working class and about the public, and a little skepticism, I would even say, about direct democracy.
No, it hadn't occurred to me until now, but he was very interested in religion early in his career, and one of the fascinating things in this book are the very early essays. We're all familiar with the Irving Kristol wrote in the Wall Street Journal and Public Interest, but he wrote a lot of essays very early on, and remarkable essays for such a young man. But he mentions in here that early in his career, he was one of the few people in his circle really interested in religion. And there's one essay in here from, I think, 1947 on Judaism.
Right.
And so do you know if he had contact with the Holocaust, or whether sort of there were, I mean, he was a Jew in Germany in the post-war.
No, I mean, one of the interesting things, well, just back up for 1 second about the book, and without getting into the details, I mean, these, with the exception of the autobiographical essay from 1995, these are all essays that were not collected. He didn't collect during his lifetime. So they're previously uncollected essays, so it doesn't overlap with, the 3 or 4 books that were published in his lifetime. And what's, I think, one of the interesting things about this book is the early essays. The first one, I think, on Auden was written when he was 22 years old. Really? Published in a little magazine that he co-founded, a little kind of radical magazine based on partisan review. And then there are these interesting essays on Lionel Trilling, and then in 1947, I think his first essay and commentary on sort of Judaism after reflecting on the Holocaust in that essay. He grew up religiously knowledgeable, I would say, but not in an observant home. He once told me that he didn't talk about this much, but after his mother died when he was, I don't know, maybe 15 or something like that, he did go to synagogue every day, certainly every week, but I think maybe every day, to say Kaddish for his mother. But after that, he went for 11 months, and then he wasn't particularly observant after that, and I think he wasn't so sure that there was such a just God if his mother had died of cancer at age 40 or something like that.